Welcome in, everyone. You're listening to Bulls Central. I'm joined me today by a very special guest, a first-time guest to the channel. She's done a number of different roles in the field of sports journalism, from covering the Orlando Sentinel, editor for the Daily Trojan. Now you know her for her great work and covering our very own Chicago Bulls for the Chicago Tribune. It's my pleasure to welcome to the show Julia Poe. Julia, thanks for making the time and appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Now, if you're not already, be sure to give Julia a follow at by Julia Poe. It's pronounced Poe, correct?
Yes, yeah,
Okay,
that's
just want to
right.
make sure. Check out all the great work that she's doing over the Chicago Tribune. Now, Julia, whenever I have guests on, there are obviously so many topics that I want to cover because really there are endless amounts of things to talk about when it comes to this team. We can talk about last night's game against the Lakers, even though it was a bit uneventful. We'll talk about the Bulls season overall today, what to expect for the rest of the year. But given the NBA trade deadline is now 2 weeks away, I want to start there. And I'll start with the most obvious player. It's been really on everyone's mind as we get closer to the deadline, and that's Zach LaVine. Zach and his camp, as well as the Bulls, at the start of the season, I think it was around mid-November or so, it was
Hmm.
reported that both sides were open to finding a new home. Despite all the rumors and speculation, all of us fans putting together our fake proposals in the trade machine, here we are recording this on the morning of January 26th. Zach LaVine still remains a member of the Chicago Bulls. Now, we did get some rumblings yesterday,
Hmm.
as first reported by James Edwards, who covers the Pistons, that there have been discussions with the Bulls and the Pistons centered around a trade for Zach LaVine, where the Bulls are seeking Bojan Bogdanovic and one of Cade Cunningham, Jaden Ivey, Jalen Duren, and Asur Thompson, if I'm not mistaken. I know you put out an article shortly after this news broke, but in your view, are there any legs or potential of a deal like this actually coming to fruition?
Yeah, I think this is the big problem with the Zach situation just at large, right? Is that the Bulls know what they want to do. They know that they have a certain bar that they want to clear. And as far as anyone can tell, no one is interested in meeting that bar, at least as of yet. Obviously,
Right.
these last 2 weeks before the deadline are going to be the ones that have some of the most like wheeling and dealing. Like, this is when you get things done. This is when time starts becoming a little bit of a hand up for some people because you can, start leaning on some pressure, be like, we have to get something done by the deadline. But I think that's the big issue that the Bulls are stuck in right now. It's kind of twofold. One is just the reality of the size of that contract, the move that you have to make. You're so tied in with that just numbers wise, you got to have a certain amount of contracts going in and out. And then
Right.
on top of that, I think the general vibe that we've gotten from the front office from the start, and I think this has been sharpened over time, is that this is not a situation where they're like, fine, let's just get rid of them. Let's just dump him and go and not care. Like, they invested in Zach. They still believe that Zach is a high quality player. He's still very locked in as far as any of us have seen with trying to contribute. In the meantime, his body's just not working with him. And so you're kind of left with this situation where they're not willing to just take that next step by any means necessary. It has to clear a certain bar. And so I think that's kind of where you're seeing that not line up with, at least at this moment, what the market demands. I think as you get closer, some of these teams like Detroit maybe get a little bit more desperate, or vice versa. But right now, they're kind of holding fast and true on that.
So, what's the latest you're hearing from your connections on the league on the status of Zach LaVine? Any potential trade deal that's getting done or discussed, even outside of just what's been most recently reported around the Detroit Pistons?
Definitely. So nothing more recent than Detroit. I think the same reporting that I've been having for the last few weeks still holds true, that the Bulls are willing to pick up the phone, hear out deals on basically anything. Obviously, a lot are not going to meet the muster of like a serious conversation. They've been trying to have those conversations since last fall. Like, they are working toward it, moving toward it, and there just is not a lot of traction anywhere. Like, you know how there's always kind of the delineation of preliminary conversations, serious conversations, etc. It's not getting past preliminary as far as anyone's seeing. And I think obviously 2 weeks, this is crunch time, but I do think that that is a little bit of a concern, that there's a high likelihood that Zach could remain in Chicago after the trade deadline.
And do you think that it's not getting past preliminary conversations because the Bulls are valuing Zach a little too highly, or they're wanting too much in a return?
I think it's so hard to tell, because I think that there is personally a value to like obviously the market will be so different this summer.
Right.
And to a certain extent, with where this team's at right now, I'm not looking at this group and saying, okay, you move Zach, you get whatever players you're getting, and then all of a sudden this goes from a play-in team to a playoff team. So it's like, what are you moving with urgency for? And I think the issue here is that because Arturas and the front office have not made moves last trade deadline and didn't make moves the trade deadline behind that, I think that's where fans start feeling bad about this current status is based on the past, not based on the actual like negotiating tactics of right now. I think it would be really tough to give up your maximum contract player who you've invested in this long for too little. I do think that that would not be a move, especially given that like this season, I just do not see being a deep legs, deep playoffs season, even if they do make some big trade. Um, so I think that's where I kind of come for it. I think there's probably a little bit of both. I think maybe they're valuing him a little bit too high. I think teams are really balking at the size of the contract. I mean, that's just numbers. Again, that's tough, but I do see the value of not just immediately dumping this high quality player. It just happens that the timing of it is really tough, especially with him being injured and just not looking good when he's been on the court the majority of the season.
Yeah, for me, when I saw the reports come out, and again, don't know as far as how much in terms of the overall validity to it, right? But if the Bulls are actually requesting, one of the four guys from the Detroit Pistons, the younger guys, it made me think, you know, maybe this is why we haven't really been seeing too many trades from the Bulls. It's not that they're just not having any conversations. It's just that their asking price is incredibly high. And not just, from this season, but the prior deadline, the deadline before that. Because I
Right.
think that's what's been, irking most fans is like, hey, we're kind of seeing the same thing over the last 3 years and
Mm-hmm.
no changes are being made. And so it begs the question, does the front office need to start lowering their overall asking price, as a
Right.
result of it? I did want to shift to DeMar DeRozan just for a second
Mm-hmm.
because DeMar has also come up in trade rumors as well, not as much, but various teams reported being interested in him if the Bulls
Right.
make him available. Obviously, DeMar is set to become an unrestricted free agent if the Bulls don't reach an extension with him before the
Mm-hmm.
summer. Have the Bulls made DeMar available in a trade? Like we keep hearing, well, these teams
Mm-hmm.
would be interested in DeMar if the Bulls are looking to trade him, but we haven't really heard anything on the Bulls taking or making calls on DeMar. Are they maybe prioritizing keeping him around and extending him?
I definitely think that they would be prioritizing two things. First, this front office really likes DeMar. I think anyone that works around him would just really like him. You see what he does in that locker room, and you get it. After one day of being around that locker room, you understand what he can be to that group. So I think extension talks still remain a heavy priority for them. I think that they would like to be able to maintain that as the status quo in Chicago. I think the other thing too is that as far as the general gist that I've gotten is that Arturas likes to be very purposeful and to take steps at a time. And obviously, when you're in a trade market, you got to pick up calls, you got to take interest and kind of gauge the market. But I don't think there would be a trade deadline scenario where he's like wheeling and dealing and he's sending out Zach and DeMar and making
Mhm.
like I don't think this is going to be a multiple move deadline. I think he'd like to move Zach, see what the group looks like with DeMar and Kobe basically at the center, and then move from there and kind of make decisions from there. And obviously, if you get up against the deadline and Zach's not moving, then maybe you have to course correct. But right now, I just don't see there being a scenario where they're sending a bunch of these guys out for bringing a bunch back in and basically doing like a retool or a restructure. It's more of just that one initial move and then like, okay, let's see what we think and what we like here.
Has there been any indication on your end as far as what they would want to see from a return for DeMar DeRozan if they are looking to maybe trade him?
Well, I think the reason that we haven't seen an extension signed yet, at least, is because, DeMar's chasing probably the highest level of compensation he could get.
Sure.
And I don't even know if it's a no from the Bulls, but again, it's that very methodical thinking thing where it's like we need to be as flexible as possible. And maybe we do get past the trade deadline even, and we look at it and we're like, you know what? No, that veteran leadership is our number one priority. I mean, he still looks as consistent as he's been, the way that he's adapted
Yeah.
his game this year, the way that he commands that younger group. Like it is very important to whatever limited success this group has had. I think they just have to look at like, okay, what contracts are we even working in, and how do we do that knowing that they like to navigate under the luxury tax? I think that's more of where they're trying to navigate, is having as much flexibility as possible, but they value DeMar so highly. I just don't see that changing a ton. Again, trade deadline can get wonky, but that's kind of where I see it right now.
And I think the other piece is depending on what happens with Zach LaVine, that'll kind of dictate extension talks with DeMar, right? Because if you trade
Right.
Zach LaVine, you bring on an expiring contract, that frees up a lot of space in terms of what you're able to do and still remaining
Right.
under the luxury tax for DeMar extension. Um, let's talk about Alex Caruso for a little bit.
Yeah.
I guess this is just going to be strictly a trade deadline podcast, everyone. But Caruso, arguably the Bulls' most impactful player when he's on the court, had another
Mm-hmm.
great game last night against his former team. Defends at a high level this season. He's greatly improved his game offensively, especially when it comes to
Mm-hmm.
his 3-point shooting. Caruso was in trade rumors last season. The Bulls were wanting a lot for him in the trade rumors anyway. Again, just
Mm-hmm.
rumors. That still remains to be the case today. Recent reports are saying that, hey, if the Bulls are going to want to move Caruso, they're going to want at least 2 first-round picks in return to even
Mm-hmm.
consider parting with Alex. Is there validity on that, or the Bulls not even really entertaining any offers on AC at this point?
So I have said this before. I truly believe this. I think Alex Caruso is going to be in trade rumors until like the day that he dies. I think that literally until he can't run anymore, there's going to be a team wanting to make a playoff push that's going to be like, I
Yeah.
think we could really benefit from Alex Caruso. And they're going to be right because I mean, he's a monster. He's so good at what he does. So I think that's where you end up seeing a lot of this noise, is that it's just logical that teams that would like to upgrade for the playoffs are going to want Caruso, and they're going to make it clear that they would like Caruso, and the Bulls are going to be like, no, because there is that certain level of it's, you know, how much desire there is for him is reflected in, I think, how they're going to price him. And it's more of that, where the Bulls know that every time that they get close to the playoffs, contending teams would be very willing to pay a pretty high price tag to upgrade their defense in that way. So they're kind of, you know, following that supply chain demand kind of like payoff, if that makes sense. So I
Yeah.
think that's where that comes from. Again, I have, in the same way of how locked in they are with DeMar, I have not gotten a real sense that they're interested in moving Caruso, and I haven't gotten a real sense either that Alex is like, I need to get to
Wanting
a
out.
playoff team right now. I think if it hit that point, then maybe there would be some changes, but he's just going to be like that. He's just going through brick walls for any team, even if it's just a play-in team. So I think, you know, you can tell why they value him so highly.
Well, what do you think the tipping point is? Where it's like, that's too good of an offer, right? Where we really do need to
Right.
do we do need to trade him?
Man, I don't know. I think I don't think we've gotten to that point yet. I can think of so many. You know, the way this team has utilized the draft in the last few years obviously doesn't really command a lot, in my opinion, a lot of uh confidence in even some of those draft picks necessarily being like the make or break for the future of this team.
Right.
And so then it's like, it's trades that I just don't think teams would be making for players that, you know, that could really upgrade this group. So it's an interesting question though. Clearly we will hit that breaking point at some point, or Alex just will decide that he would like to go elsewhere. But right now I just don't really see there being a realistic like timeline on that.
So then, Julia, I guess as a whole, when it comes to this trade deadline, is what do the Bulls do? To me, this seems
Right.
like a very pivotal deadline for the Bulls. Direction really has to be decided upon these next couple weeks. We know that this team is not a contending team, but they're not
Right.
bad enough to be bottoming out where, certain changes and moves, they could make could be better, but does it put them into contention? No, probably not.
Mhm.
So in your view, I guess it's a two-part question. In your view, what's the direction the Bulls should take at the deadline? And what direction will the Bulls actually make when February 8th rolls around?
Yeah. It's tough. I personally would be and this is in by no means a reflection of my opinion on like him as a player or his work ethic or anything like that. I think Zach's been really trying this season, pretty visibly through a pretty, tough situation. But I think you've got to figure something out at the deadline for him. And I think for me, where I would be at, and it might not make the most like trade logical sense, but I think when you think of teams in like eras and think about like being able to close one chapter and start a new one,
Mhm.
this team knows who the like heartbeat of this team is. Like they have redefined that this season around
Yeah.
a very good player in Kobe White that you can really start building around, who's young, and you can see the promise, you can see the potential in the future. And I think as quickly as you can get to that next chapter, um, there's it's not addition by subtraction. You need a good deal, but I think you need to lower a little bit your expectations of what that good deal is. You can't just stand pat at another trade deadline. And I quite honestly feel that even, making a buyout signing or making like a smaller trade, I think anything that's not a major trade is still going to feel like standing pat for the Bulls with
Yeah.
where they're at. And you kind of dig yourself into a hole when you don't do anything the last 2 years. I don't even think they were wrong to not do anything that first year, but you just kind of get yourself into that position where I think, and I don't think the locker room needs it. There's no sense that I get that there is a poor culture or a poor energy in the locker room with Zach around, but it's just you just need to have that focus. And until they move on, it's always going to be kind of that split feeling of like, okay, who is the star here? Who is the center of this team? So that would be my priority. I genuinely worry, and again, worry is the wrong word. That's too strong. But I genuinely do think there's a high likelihood that Zach stays through the trade deadline, just with where we're at. And I don't know what you do with that. I think that's going to be really, really disappointing to fans if that's how this goes.
And do you think there's a possibility that the front office does in fact stand pat at the deadline, just based on everything we know at this point in time?
I think it's so difficult because again, I like I said, the general understanding that I've gotten is this purposeful wanting to make one move at a time. So I don't know at what point you pull the trigger on, okay, Zach's not moving. We're 4 days, let's say hypothetically, out from the trade deadline. We've got to pivot. I just
Mhm.
don't know when that happens and when they shift that gear or if they will. I think it's always a chance. I mean, inaction is like always a chance with this front office. I don't enjoy saying that, but it's just true. I do think that at a certain point, they've got to look at where they're at and recognize that, like, okay, we said that if it didn't work in year three, we would make changes, and it's not working in year three. So we have to make changes and that they would pivot. I just don't know when that breaking point happens. We haven't hit it yet, as far as I'm aware.
Do you think a loss? I was talking about this last night in my post game video. Do you think a loss like last night, in a way, almost helps that? Because there's a point, right, where the Bulls really
Mm-hmm.
started making strides in the right direction, and they still have been looking a lot better. I mean, last night's game
Yeah.
aside, where you almost feel like the front office might be under this false assumption that, hey, we're kind of turning a corner. Maybe we don't need to make any moves. So, do you think a loss like last night, and then obviously the collapse against the Suns, even though the Bulls played well in that game, but
Mm-hmm.
the 23-point blown lead might actually push this a little more to say, okay, we do need to still focus on making changes and at the deadline, not in the off season?
Sure. I think losses leading up to the deadline always help you with that. I think when I've spoken to Arturs in the past, he has talked about not like really fighting recency bias and really
Mhm.
trying not to fall trap into that, because I mean we saw the opposite of it in past years where the Bulls looked so good right up into the trade deadline, and then afterward you're like, oh yikes, what's going on? I don't think individual losses have as big of an impact as you would think because front offices are trying so hard not to let them. I do worry that what ends up happening then is that you excuse the losses, but the wins still kind of stick with you. It's the hope that kills you,
Right,
and it
right.
just kind of sticks in there. I think even that Phoenix game, unfortunately, was more of a hope moment than anything for them. I mean, that was a great game. A lot of players looked really good in that game. Um, so yeah, I think, the recency bias is always going to play into it. I think the biggest thing that's kind of an unknown variable there, though, is that like Zach isn't playing. So either
Mm.
way, I think it makes it really difficult to draw any conclusions this season. I thought the team looked really nice with him when he came back for that little stint after his injury, where he was, really assist focused. And so, do you look at that? Is that your recency bias? It's just there's so many parts of this season, and I've written about this before, that you could pull out and say, this is who this team is, and they're
Mhm.
all so different, and I just don't know which of those streaks the front office is going to pull out and look at and be like, no, this is who this team is. This is what's true, if that makes sense.
No, it does. It does. It's going to be interesting, right?
Yeah,
These weeks are going to come up, and we'll see the fan reactions. I'm sure fans are going to be upset no matter what happens. That's just kind of how it
yeah,
is sometimes. Let's shift gears just a little bit away from the trade deadline. I
sure.
did want to ask about Lonzo Ball for a minute because I feel like it's a topic that's likely going to be coming up more and more as we get closer to
Hmm.
this offseason and going into training camp, and whether Lonzo will be able to rejoin the team by then. We got to see him on the bench last night
Yeah.
against the Lakers. The reason I want to ask you is because you recently put out an article for the Tribune that Lonzo has experienced no setbacks in his recovery, but
Hmm.
still hasn't quite yet been cleared for straightaway sprints, which kind of, to my understanding, right, has kind of been to that point every step in Lonzo's recovery where he's been able to, he
Yes.
has not been able to progress beyond that. Can you elaborate any more if there's been any further progress on his path to recovery and what it was like for him also to just reconnect with the team when they came
Yeah.
to LA?
Yeah, it was cool to see him. It was fun seeing him. He was like planted next to Dalen for most of that game, and
Yeah.
Dalen Terry is just like the funniest dude ever. And every time I looked over, Alonso was just like cracking up on the sideline at something. So it was good to see. You could tell the guys were like really happy to see him. This week was a little unfortunate. So both from a reconnecting standpoint and from a recovery standpoint, Lonzo was supposed to do two things this week. He was supposed to be elevating to the straight ahead sprinting this week.
Mm.
And then also he was supposed to be around the team more. He was going to be, like at UCLA at practice, etc. Got the flu, was not
Wow.
able to be doing anything for like a solid week, was barely able to make it to the game last night. He wasn't even feeling super well that
Mm.
morning. So that's just one of those little like human setbacks. So he has not progressed up to the sprinting yet, but because he got sick, not because of any setbacks that occurred. That also meant that we didn't get to speak with him, which was a little bit of a bummer. We were hoping to, at least hear from him kind of how things are doing, because we get all of our information through Billy Donovan primarily, and
Right.
he's getting that through Lonzo, who's getting it from his trainers. So it's like a little game of telephone. So we haven't heard that latest round of updates from him yet, but it sounds like he's been able to do a decent amount of like side to side mobility, a decent amount of kind of getting on the court, doing some of that. It's just the straight ahead sprinting has not occurred yet.
Do you think, and I guess it's the question that's on everyone's mind, do you think he'll
Yeah.
be able to come back and actually be a productive player going into next season, or really just in general, recover his career?
Right. I sure hope so. Lonzo is such a bright, just like really positive, solid dude, in the limited amount of interactions I've had with him. And this has been obviously like very, very difficult for him and
Yeah.
just beyond the team. Um, it's so hard to even predict how this is going to go when so few people have had this procedure. I'm a huge soccer fan, and one of the only other three professional athletes who's had this cartilage transplant, who's like active right now, she just retired last week
Mhm.
because she gave it a solid year and a half. She's like a high profile player with the national team, and just hit a point where she's like, I just, I'm pain free, but I can't do much more. And I'm hanging up the boots. And, you see stuff like that. And it definitely makes you wonder, like, okay, how well can this work? How far can this go? But there's just so few people that have gone through it that like I don't even think I'm qualified to really predict that. I love hearing that he's not experiencing pain. Love hearing that at least everyday life is normal for him. But I think until he clears the sprinting, we just have no we're kind of rudderless here in terms of being able to predict that. If he's able to start sprinting February, March, like I do think I'm going to feel more positive than I felt in at least a year about it.
And you mentioned because we got the flu, right? He wasn't able to take that next
Yes.
step. Is the idea now in the next, I don't know, a few weeks that they're going to attempt
Yeah.
that anyway?
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
So he had his first, I think yesterday he had his first workout since getting sick. And my guess is that they'll probably ramp him back up first to make sure that he's feeling good doing whatever he was doing prior to getting sick. And then they'll kind of start installing that next step up.
Got it. I was thinking about this a few weeks ago. I wanted to get your thoughts on it as well. As
Yeah.
Bulls fans,
Yeah.
we kind of been, clinging on to this hope that Lonzo, returning somehow, still being the player that he used to be, is going to happen, right? Which I think we all know at
Right.
the end of the day is unlikely going to be the case, but maybe it will. But one thing I was curious about was with the rise of Kobe White, the breakout season that he's been having, and really
Mm-hmm.
cementing himself as the Bulls' starting point guard, both for now and for the future. Should Lonzo come back and let's say he returns to the same Lonzo we knew before, what does that mean for his role on the team as well as Kobe's going into next season? What do you think?
For sure. I think that everything that Kobe is doing so incredibly well right now works just as well as an off-ball shooting guard. Like
Sure.
Lonzo has never been a primary scorer point guard. He's
Mhm.
always been that facilitator. And as good as Kobe has been as a facilitator, we've also seen this season that like part of the way they make that work is that DeMar is assisting more, Vooch is assisting more. Like it's more of a 3 or 4 man kind of like facilitator offense. It's not like Kobe coming down and then being this crazy pass first point guard. So I think that that would actually in some ways be an upgrade for Kobe. I think him being able to come down and be the guy to have more catch and shoot opportunities as well. I think there'd be a lot of positives. It would definitely be a new step and a new challenge of him figuring out like, okay, I've been able to be the guy because I have the ball in my hands every time I'm bringing it up the court. And now how do I initiate that when Lonzo's bringing the ball up and when he's initiating the offense? But with the way Lonzo plays and the way that Kobe plays, I don't see that being a problem. I see that being just an adjustment period, if anything else. Would love to see it, definitely.
And so, well, I guess the other problem then is Zach LaVine, right? So I guess in this scenario, it means Zach is probably not with the team,
Yeah,
right? I mean, because everyone's talking about it's either the deadline or it's going to be the off season, right? But
right,
but I guess in
right.
this scenario, that would mean that Zach would have to be elsewhere.
Yes, yeah, yeah. At that point, I think if you're trying to run an offense where you've got Zach, Kobe, DeMar, and Vooch in the starting lineup, I mean, A, it's going to be the smallest team in the NBA, and B,
Right.
that's just too many cooks in that kitchen.
Yeah. So, Julia, I'll get you out here on this one. And I know this can be obviously subject to change depending on what the Bulls do at the deadline. Where do you see the team finishing this season? And if it's the playoffs, how far are they getting?
Yeah, I think that where they are at right now is kind of who this team is. I think holding that ninth spot in the East, staying just tantalizingly close to 500, but underneath it, and kind of riding that consistently. I think we'll probably get a couple little streaks where they flirt with being 500, but I think this team's probably going to finish like 2 or 3 games below. And then right back to the play-in tournament. I think my big question is whether they make it out of the play-in tournament or not this season, which they certainly could. They've been really good in the clutch. They've been good in kind of some of those bigger moments. And I think the play-in tournament pool kind of works to their advantages. But yeah, I don't see this being an outright playoffs team. I think they're going to have to get there through the play-in, and I don't think it goes beyond first round from there.
And that's the thing, right? It's like even if they do make the playoffs, they get in by way of the play, and it's like you're gonna be playing the Celtics or the
Yeah,
Bucks. Are you gonna be able to beat them in a 7 game series on the
yeah,
road?
yeah. You're yeah. It's not. I just do not see. And again, this is what I was talking about with the trade deadline. It's like, what are you working toward? What are you going to do at the trade deadline that's really going to upgrade or change that? I I don't really know what the answer is on that, but it doesn't feel like the identity of this team this season is much higher than, like I said, just that play in caliber.
Yeah, and I think as Bulls fans, we're all kind of seeing it too, and it's why we want to see some action come the
Yeah,
deadline. But we'll see. In 2 weeks, we'll obviously know what this team looks like, whether or not Zach is still going to be on the team, whether or not some additional moves might potentially be made. But Julia, I cannot thank you enough for taking the time out of your day to meet with me again at such a busy time of the year with the trade deadline approaching. Keep up the great work over the Tribune. I speak for all of Bulls Nation when I say we appreciate you keeping the fan base updated and informed. So take care and best of luck of the rest of the season.
thank you so much. Appreciate it.
All right. And thanks for tuning in, everyone, Bulls Nation. I'll catch you guys in the next one.